Hello everyone, we are group number 6. I'm Sergio Rafael Marinka, and my classmate is
Fernando Leonel Serpa.
In this chapter, we will explore how England was transformed after the Norman conquest, from the ground of loyal administration to the system of justice, the rise of towns, and the cultural achievements of the period. Each aspect reveals how power and daily life were deeply connected. Let's begin with the growth of the government. William the Conqueror governed England and Normandy by traveling from place to place, ensuring his authority was accepted. Wherever he went, locals had to provide food and shelter for the king and his large household. This often caused food shortages and rising prices. The king's household acted as the government, but it was always on the move. Kings were crowned in the Westminster, but the treasury stayed in Winchester, the old Wessex capital. The real capital, however, was wherever the king's saddle took him. As the kingdom grew, and kings ruled parts of France as well, they could no longer travel everywhere themselves. Instead, they appointed nobles and knights as sheriff to manage taxation, justice, and the king's orders locally. The administration kept careful records in Westminster, including the famous Domesday Book. Officials watched noble families, towns, and ports to ensure taxes were paid and fines collected. Every way possible, the kings made sure he claimed his due. Taxation changed over time. In 1113, Henry I got most of his income from land and feudal dues, with only a small part from taxes. By Edward I's reign, over half of royal income came from taxes, prompting the king to call representative of those he could tax most effectively to Parliament. The royal administration grew rapidly when William invaded Britain. Only a few clerics managed paperwork. By the time of Edward I, even the poorest man needed a seal to sign official documents, and copies of letters and documents were kept in Westminster. Now that we've seen how government expanded, let's move on.
Now we come to the section of law and justice. In medieval England, the king was responsible for law and justice, but he could not manage every case for himself. The administration was left to a different person in each district, so they each had different laws and customs. After the Norman conquest, nobles were allowed to administer justice on their own lands, often mixing Norman laws with older Saxon customs. However, serious crimes were reserved for the king's courts. Henry I introduced the idea that all crimes, even family disputes, were breaking the king's peace. This meant it was the king's duty to punish their wrongdoings, not just the families. To make justice more consistent, he appointed traveling judges who moved from place to place to try crimes and settle property disputes. At first, these judges were not professionals and relied on common sense. Coming the end of the 12th century, these traveling judges eventually became knowledgeable in laws and formed the foundation of common law. It was a set of laws that were applied uniformly across England. Unlike most of Europe, which relied on Roman civil law or canon law from the church, English common law was based on customs, past cases, and experiences. It replaced the patchwork of local laws and helped create a single cohesive legal system. During this period, England also moved away from trial by ordeal, which had tested guilt through dangerous rituals, such as holding a hot iron over the tongue. By the end of the 12th century, trial by jury became the standard. Ordinary people, often 12 neighbors of the accused, were asked to help by providing evidence in favor of the accused. It eventually became ordinary people judging cases based on common sense. Over time, law schools were established to train lawyers to give advice, ensuring that the juries could make informed decisions. This combination of royal oversight, traveling judges, and juries helped centralize justice, making the law fairer and more predictable for people across the kingdom. This set the basis of the law system we see in actuality in England. Now, religious beliefs. At the time of William I, the church at a village level was very different from the powerful political church the king had to deal with. Ordinary village priests were often from the peasant community and could barely read. Most were married and many inherited their position from their fathers. The church usually belonged to the local lord and was often built next to his house. But even at this village level, the church wanted to replace the lord's authority. But it was not that successful. Lords continued to influence the choices of priests in many villages. Meanwhile, the church successfully discouraged priests from marrying, and by the end of the 13th century, married priests were really unusual, although some still kept mistresses in secret. The ones that maintained their purity were men and women that chose to enter monasteries or nunneries. Life in a religious house was safer and more secure than farming, and offered education, food, and shelter. This was especially important as population growth made it harder to feed families, so sometimes parents gave their children to religious houses for their future. Monasteries became the centers of wealth and learning. In 1066, there were around 50 religious houses in England, home to roughly 1,000 monks and nuns. By the 14th century, this number had risen to about 900 houses with 17,500 members, despite the population having tripled. The 13th century also saw the rise of wandering friars. Unlike the wealthy monasteries and cathedrals, friars focused on preaching to ordinary people, living among the poor and bringing comfort and guidance in the daily life. They emphasized spiritual care over church power and splendor, highlighting a new form of religious influence within the English society.
Something is missing. We talk about religion, kings, law, and justice, but something is... Oh yes, ordinary people in country and town. In 1066, England had about 1.5 to 2 million people, and 19th of them live in the countryside. Life in village, especially in the south and east, was extremely hard. Houses were simple, built with wooden beams, mud walls, and thick thatched roofs. People ate mostly cereals and vegetables, with meat reserved for special occasions. Daily work was from dawn to dusk, year-round, until they could no longer work. The manorial system structured village life. Villagers, or serfs, exchanged labor on the lord's home farm for protection and the right to work their own small strips of land. Over 3/4 of the rural population were serfs, tied to the land and unable to live without permission. Despite its hardship, this system offered stability and order. The Normans developed the manorial system further, and the early Norman Saxons, tensions meant mistrust and sometimes harsh punishment. Tales like Robin Hood's, rooted in the Saxon resentment of Norman rule, reflected the common people's struggle against feudal authority. By the 12th and 13th centuries, population growth put increasing pressure on the land and food supply. Peasants trying to farm more land, but poor harvest led to hunger and poverty. Economic pressures also affected knights and smaller landholders, who often became in debt to money lenders, such as the Jewish community, which eventually faced expulsion in 1290. Feudalism was gradually weakening. While larger landlords grew richer, peasants and smaller landholders often lost their lands. Many landless villagers moved to towns seeking better opportunities, marking the beginning of social and economic shifts that would shape medieval England. Something feels off here. Something is still missing here. We already covered almost the whole chapter, but something is missing, isn't it?
Yes.
Let's move on to the last part of this presentation that actually is one of the most important. So it is the growth of towns and centers of wealth. As we said, most of people abandon their homeland and travel to the towns in order to look for new opportunities.
It's striking how towns became so important in medieval England. They weren't just small markets anymore, they turned into centers of real wealth.
Exactly. Trade made the difference. Wool in particular changed everything. England's wool was exported to the Low Countries, where it was turned into fine cloth. That trade alone gave towns a new role in the economy.
And it wasn't only about exports. Towns depending on the countryside for resources. Some men went around village collecting wool, then sold it in fairs and markets. That constant exchanges kept both towns and rural areas connected.
Yes, but towns also started to break free from feudal control. Many received charters of freedom from the king, which meant they could govern themselves and handle their own taxes. That was a big shift.
True. And inside the towns, society was transforming as well. Guilds began to organize trade and crafts. Merchant guilds first, and then craft guilds for trades like weaving. They didn't just control business, they protected their members too.
And in London, guilds went even further. They became the powerful livery companies, which influenced not only trade but also politics. They show how towns were becoming self-sufficient and powerful on their own right.
So really, towns weren't just places of trade, they marked the rise of the middle class and the beginning of capitalism in England.
And at least, but not less important, we need to talk about language, literature, and culture. They're important.
Yes.
The 12th century Renaissance reached England and brought a real boost in literacy and learning.
Yes, new schools appeared, all teaching Latin so ideas could spread across Europe. Later, Oxford and Cambridge became the centers of knowledge.
But most people still spoke only English, not Latin or French. Over time, though, French words entered daily use.
Right, like chair instead of stool, or stomach instead of belly. Language, learning, and culture were all evolving together.
Wow, incredible.
Exactly.
Thank you, everyone.